I wore black to my own funeral. Not my body's funeral, but the death of everything I had been told I was worth. They said mourning made me look severe. Too severe for a woman who should be grateful. Too proud for a widow whose husband's family had given her shelter when she had nothing left but his name. The rain began as the solicitor opened the leather case. I remember the sound, soft at first, then insistent against the library windows of Ashford Hall. November rain in 1873 fell differently than it does in memory. Heavier. As if the sky itself knew what was about to break open in that room lined with books no woman was ever invited to read. My mother-in-law sat across from me in emerald silk, her fingers adorned with rings that caught the firelight. Beside her, my sister-in-law Marianne adjusted her shawl with the casual elegance of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Behind them, the oil portrait of my late husband Edward stared down with painted indifference, his eyes following nothing, revealing nothing. I had been a wife for 7 years. I had been a widow for 3 months. And in all that time, I had learned to be invisible in rooms where I was always present. The solicitor cleared his throat. Mr. Pemberton, a man whose spectacles reflected lamplight in small moons of glass, spread the papers across the mahogany table with hands that trembled slightly. He was nervous. I noticed because I had learned to notice everything, the tension in a servant's shoulders, the pause before a dismissive word, the way people looked past you when they had already decided you did not matter. Mrs. Ashford, he began, addressing my mother-in-law, not me. The younger Mrs. Ashford, he meant, the one who truly mattered. The late Mr. Edward Ashford's will contains several provisions that require immediate attention. I folded my hands in my lap. Black crape whispered against my wrists. I had chosen this dress carefully that morning, knowing they would disapprove, knowing they would find it excessive for a woman who should be moving toward colours again, toward life again, toward forgetting that she had ever been loved by a man whose mother despised her. But I was not ready to forget. I was ready to remember everything. They had begun their work 3 months earlier, on the morning after Edward's sudden death. A fever, the doctors said. Unexpected. Tragic. But these things happen. And while I sat beside his cooling body, holding a hand that would never hold mine again, they had already started the calculations, the measurements of what would be taken from me. At first, it was subtle. A comment about how difficult it must be for me to manage without Edward's guidance. A suggestion that perhaps I might be more comfortable in the smaller sitting room, as the main parlour would be needed for family gatherings. Family. The word they used to mean everyone except me. Then it became less subtle. My personal correspondence began arriving, opened. The household accounts, which I had managed for 7 years, were suddenly removed from my supervision. When I asked about the quarterly allowance Edward had always provided me, I was told that such matters would need to be reviewed. Reviewed by whom? I asked. By those who understand these things, they said. I understood. I understood that they believed me to be a governess's daughter who had somehow enchanted their son into an unsuitable marriage. I understood that every day I remained in Ashford Hall was, to them, an act of charity they performed with increasing resentment. I understood that they were waiting for me to realise my place and disappear quietly into whatever small life they deemed appropriate for someone of my unfortunate origins. But Edward had loved me. That was the one thing they could never calculate away. Mr. Pemberton adjusted his spectacles. The estate, as you know, passes to the eldest male heir, which in the absence of children would be my nephew Charles. my mother-in-law interrupted smoothly. As it should be. The Ashford estate has remained in the family for 6 generations, Mr. Pemberton. We have no intention of allowing it to be fragmented by... She paused delicately. Complicated arrangements. She did not look at me. She never looked at me directly when she spoke about my future. It was as if acknowledging my presence would make the inconvenience of me more real. However, Mr. Pemberton continued, and something in his tone made me lift my eyes from my folded hands. However, Mr. Edward Ashford made certain provisions that must be honoured regardless of traditional expectations. The room changed then, not visibly, but in the way air changes before lightning. I felt it in the tightening of my mother-in-law's jaw, in the sudden stillness of Marianne's hands upon her shawl. Provisions, my mother-in-law repeated. Her voice remained gracious, but I heard the edge beneath it. What sort of provisions? Mr. Pemberton looked at me for the first time. Really looked at me. Mrs. Catherine Ashford is to receive the full income from the Thornfield properties for the duration of her life. She is also granted exclusive residence in the east wing of Ashford Hall, with a guaranteed annual income of £800, to be drawn from the estate quarterly, without question or oversight. Silence. The fire crackled. Rain drummed against the windows. That's impossible, Marianne said. The Thornfield properties generate nearly £2,000 annually. You're saying she gestured at me as if I were a stain on upholstery. She receives that while the estate must manage on what remains. I'm saying, Mr. Pemberton replied with unexpected firmness, that your brother made these provisions 3 months before his death. They are legally binding and meticulously documented. My mother-in-law rose. She moved like a woman who had never been contradicted, who could not conceive of a world that did not arrange itself according to her expectations. This is not acceptable. My son would never have left the estate in such a condition. There must be some mistake. She looked at me now, fully looked at me, and I saw the accusation forming. Some influence that altered his judgment. Mother, I said quietly. The word felt strange in my mouth. I had called her that at Edward's request, though she had never once called me daughter. Edward knew exactly what he was doing. You know nothing of what Edward intended, she snapped. You were a passing fancy, a momentary lapse in judgment that he would have corrected given time. I stood then, slowly, the way I had learned to stand in rooms full of people who did not want me there. Edward loved me, and he knew exactly how you would treat me once he was gone. How dare you? He knew, I continued, my voice steady, because he saw how you treated me while he was alive. He noticed every slight, every dismissal, every time you spoke over me or past me or about me as if I were furniture. He noticed, Mother, and he made arrangements. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat again. There is more. We all turned to him. Mr. Ashford also stipulated that should any member of the family contest these provisions or make Mrs. Catherine Ashford's residence at Ashford Hall untenable through deliberate mistreatment, the entirety of his personal fortune, some £15,000 currently held in trust, will be donated to the London Society for Women's Rights and Education. The room seemed to tilt. £15,000. A fortune that could change the trajectory of the estate for generations. Gone if they pushed me out. Gone if they made my life unbearable enough that I chose to leave. Edward had built me a fortress out of their own greed. My mother-in-law sank back into her chair. Her face had gone pale beneath the powder and rouge. Marianne looked between us, her mouth opening and closing without sound. He wouldn't, my mother-in-law whispered. He wouldn't destroy his family's legacy for his wife, I finished. He would. He did. I moved towards the door, my black dress rustling in the silence. At the threshold, I paused and turned back. They looked small suddenly, surrounded by their grand furniture and their ancient portraits and their belief in a world that Edward had quietly, deliberately dismantled. I will take my tea in the East Wing, I said. From now on, I will take all my meals there. I will use the eastern entrance. I will not attend family gatherings unless specifically invited. I will, in every way, make my presence as minimal as my husband's will allows. But I will remain. And every quarter, when that income is delivered, you will remember that he loved me enough to protect me from you. Mr. Pemberton gathered his papers. I will need all parties to sign the acknowledgement of terms. Of course, I said. I'm quite prepared to acknowledge what Edward gave me. I signed first. My hand did not shake. Behind me, I heard my mother-in-law's pen scratch across the paper with the sound of something breaking. The weeks that followed were quiet, deliberately, intentionally quiet. I took possession of the East Wing, 6 rooms that had been shut up for a decade, filled with furniture draped in cloth like ghosts. I opened the windows and let the November air sweep through, carrying away the mustiness of neglect. I chose new wallpaper from samples in the village, pale blue with silver threads. I ordered books sent from London, novels and philosophy and poetry that I had been told were unsuitable for a woman of my modest education. I learned that money, even a modest independence, changes everything. Shopkeepers who had once treated me with polite distance now greeted me by name. The vicar's wife, who had pointedly excluded me from her charity committee, suddenly discovered that my insights on organisational matters might be valuable. The world, I realised, respects the weight of coins more readily than the weight of grief. But I did not seek their society. Not yet. Instead, I spent those weeks reading Edward's letters. He had left them for me in a locked box, the key hidden in the lining of his favourite jacket, which I had kept despite being told it should be given away. 37 letters, written over the course of our marriage, never sent, never meant to be read until after his death. They were love letters. But more than that, they were instructions. My dearest Catherine, the first one began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are alone among people who have never valued you as you deserve. I have made provisions, but provisions alone will not protect you from their subtler cruelties. You must be vigilant. You must remember that kindness can be withdrawn as quickly as it is offered, and that power, once tasted, is rarely surrendered gracefully. He had known. Every conversation we'd had about his mother's coldness, every time he'd defended me at family dinners, every moment he'd held me in the darkness and promised that I would always be cared for, he had known he was dying. The fever had not been sudden. The doctors had warned him months earlier about his weakening heart. He had simply chosen not to burden me with the knowledge until arrangements were complete. Watch Marianne, one letter warned. She resents any woman my mother favours, and she will see your independence as a theft of resources she believes should be hers. But she is more bark than bite. Its mother you must truly guard against. She is patient. She will wait for you to make a mistake, to show weakness, to give her the ammunition she needs to force your hand. Another letter contained a list of names. Allies, he called them. People in London society who owed him favours or respected his judgment. Lawyers, businessmen, 2 members of Parliament. Contact them if you need support, he wrote. Let it be known that you are not without protection beyond the will. Let them know that harming you will have consequences beyond the financial. But it was the final letter, dated a week before his death, that broke something open inside me. Catherine, he wrote, I have given you financial security, but that is not enough. I have watched you dim yourself for 7 years, making yourself smaller so that you might fit into their narrow vision of what a wife should be. I have watched you apologise for your intelligence, your education, your very existence in their world. I can no longer bear it. The money is not meant to keep you comfortable in captivity. It is meant to give you the power to remake your life into something true. Leave Ashford Hall if you wish. Live in London, travel the continent, study at university if they'll have you. Or stay and make them acknowledge what they have always refused to see, that you are more than they ever allowed you to be. But whatever you choose, Catherine, promise me this. Do not forgive them simply because time passes and grief makes you soft. They do not deserve forgiveness. They deserve to live with the knowledge that they were wrong about you and that their son saw through them clearly enough to build walls they cannot breach. I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in a sandalwood box. Then I sat in the window seat of my new sitting room and watched the winter light fade over the gardens that had never been mine to walk in freely. Edward had given me freedom, but he had also given me something more dangerous and more precious, permission to stop pretending. The first dinner invitation arrived in January. Marianne was hosting a small gathering. Intimate, she said, just family and a few close friends. It would mean so much if I would attend, if we could begin to heal the rifts that had opened in our shared grief. I almost laughed. She had been coached well. The words were hers, but the strategy belonged to her mother. They were probing, testing to see if time and isolation had softened me, if I might be ready to return to my place as the grateful dependent. I declined politely. A headache, I claimed. These late winter months are so trying. The second invitation came in February, this time for a charity auction to benefit the village school. Surely I would want to support such a worthy cause. Surely I understood how it would appear if I continued to absent myself from family obligations. I attended, but I arrived in my own carriage, a modest one, but mine, purchased with my first quarterly income. I wore lavender, the half-mourning shade that announced I was moving beyond deepest grief, but was not yet ready to fully rejoin the world of colour and frivolity. And I brought a donation of £50, presented publicly, with a small speech about Edward's commitment to education that made his mother's smile brittle as January ice. I was learning the rules of a game I had never been allowed to play. Money spoke. Public appearances mattered, and reputation, the most fragile and valuable of Victorian currencies, could be shaped by those who understood its mechanisms. Over the following months, I began to build something new. I hired a companion, Miss Sarah Fletcher, a woman of 45 who had spent 2 decades as a governess before her employer's death left her without position. She was sharp-minded, well-read, and had no patience for the sort of petty cruelties that passed for gentility in houses like Ashford Hall. We took morning walks together, discussed books over tea, and slowly I remembered what it felt like to speak without measuring every word against someone else's disapproval. I also began attending meetings of the London Society for Women's Rights and Education, the very organisation Edward had named in his will. At first, I went out of curiosity, but I stayed because I found women who understood the particular cage of widowhood in a world that defined a woman's worth through her relationships to men. Women who had been dismissed, silenced, controlled, and who were fighting to change the laws that made such control possible. I donated generously, and I made friends. It was through these friends that I learned the truth about Edward's death. We were having tea at the Society's offices in Bloomsbury when Helen Prescott, a woman whose husband had tried to have her committed to an asylum for the crime of inheriting property, mentioned that she knew a doctor who had treated patients at the hospital where Edward had died. He said it was unusual, she remarked casually, stirring sugar into her cup. A man in his 30s, previously healthy, suddenly developing a fever that killed him within 48 hours. And there were questions about the medication he'd been given in the final hours. I set down my teacup carefully. What sort of questions? Helen hesitated. The sort that get hushed up when a prominent family is involved. But my friend said the symptoms were consistent with an overdose of laudanum, and that someone had been visiting the sick room regularly, someone who wasn't immediate family, but who had access to the medical supplies. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table. Who? I whispered. He didn't know the name, only that it was a woman. Older. Someone who the staff assumed had authority to be there. I knew. In the way you sometimes know things without needing proof, without needing evidence, I knew. Edward's mother had killed him. Not directly, perhaps. Not with her own hands measuring out the poison. But she had been there, in those final hours when the doctors said his heart was failing, when they'd given him laudanum for the pain, when he'd slipped into unconsciousness and never woken. She had been there, and she had made certain he would never recover, because he had changed his will, because he had chosen me over the family legacy, because he had dared to love someone they considered beneath him, and they had made him pay for it. The rage came slowly, not hot but cold, a rage that lived in my bones and crystallized in my chest like ice forming over a winter lake. I did not weep, I did not scream, I did not make scenes. Instead, I went home to Ashford Hall and began to plan. Edward had taught me to be vigilant. Now I would teach his family what vigilance truly meant. I started with Marianne. She had debts, I discovered. Considerable ones. Her husband gambled, a fact the family worked hard to conceal. She had been borrowing against her future inheritance, taking small loans from merchants and moneylenders who charged exorbitant interest. She was desperate, and desperation made people careless. I bought the debts, all of them, through intermediaries, through carefully constructed chains of ownership that kept my name hidden until the moment I chose to reveal it. Then I sent her a letter, private, personal, offering to forgive the entire sum in exchange for a single truthful conversation about the night Edward died. She came to my sitting room like a woman walking to her own execution, pale, shaking, still trying to maintain dignity even as it crumbled around her. "You can't prove anything," she said before I'd even asked the question. "I'm not trying to prove anything," I replied. "I'm simply asking for the truth. What happened the night Edward died?" She looked at me with something almost like pity. "You really believe she would have let him ruin everything? The will, the provisions, the way he'd arranged things to humiliate her after his death? She couldn't allow it. So she killed him. She said it was mercy, that he was suffering, that the fever would have killed him anyway. She said she was just hastening the inevitable." I felt nothing. That was the strangest part. I sat there listening to confirmation that my husband had been murdered by his own mother, and I felt nothing at all except the cold clarity of purpose. "Thank you," I said. "Your debts are forgiven. All of them." "What are you going to do?" Marianne asked. "I'm going to make sure," I said quietly, "that she lives with what she's done, that every day for the rest of her life she knows that I know, and that there is nothing she can do about it." The dinner party was held in late spring. My mother-in-law's birthday, a grand affair with 50 guests, the county's most prominent families gathered in the ballroom that had once made me feel so small. I had not attended a social function at Ashford Hall since Edward's death. My presence caused a stir. I wore burgundy silk, no longer mourning. Ready, the dress announced to rejoin society. I arrived with Miss Fletcher and Helen Prescott, the latter having become something of a cause célèbre in London society for her advocacy work. People whispered, not cruelly, but with interest. Who was this Mrs. Ashford who commanded such interesting friendships? I waited until dinner was served, until the soup course had been cleared and the fish course was being presented, until conversation had grown comfortable and wine had loosened tongues. Then I stood. The room quieted. "I would like to propose a toast," I said. My voice carried. I had learned to project, had learned that a woman's voice could fill a room if she simply refused to let it be diminished. "To Edward Ashford," I continued. "A man of principle and foresight. A man who understood that love requires protection, especially in families that do not always act with love." My mother-in-law's face was stone. "Edward was ill for months before his death," I said. "Did you all know that?" He concealed it beautifully. But he knew he was dying, and he made arrangements. Meticulous arrangements to ensure that those he loved would be cared for, and that those who might seek to harm them would face consequences. I could feel the attention of every person in the room. This was not proper dinner conversation. This was scandalous. But no one moved to stop me. "He left letters," I continued. "Instructions. Evidence of his intentions and his awareness of certain family dynamics. These letters are now held in trust with his solicitor, with instructions that they be opened and read publicly should any harm come to me, should I die under unusual circumstances, or should I choose to request their disclosure." My mother-in-law stood. "This is neither the time nor the place." "You're right," I agreed. "This is not the time or place to discuss how Edward died, how a previously healthy man suddenly succumbed to a fever after being given medication by someone who had everything to gain from his death. That conversation should happen in private. But I wanted everyone here to know that such a conversation is possible, that evidence exists, that justice, though delayed, is not impossible." The silence was absolute. "So let us toast," I said, raising my glass. "To Edward, to his memory, and to the truth that eventually, inevitably, finds its way into the light." I drank. A few guests, uncomfortable but unsure what else to do, joined me. Most simply stared. My mother-in-law sank back into her chair. She had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The power she had wielded so effortlessly, the certainty that her position made her untouchable, had evaporated like morning mist. I left the party early. There was no need to stay. The point had been made. The letters came the next morning. First from my mother-in-law, begging for a private meeting. Then from the family solicitor, requesting clarification. Then from Marianne, apologising for things she did not name but desperately wished forgotten. I answered none of them immediately. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Let them feel what it was like to live with uncertainty and fear. When I finally agreed to meet my mother-in-law, it was in my sitting room, on my terms. She came alone, without the armour of other family members or social propriety to shield her. She looked smaller than I remembered, older. The woman who had made me feel insignificant for 7 years now sat across from me and could not meet my eyes. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse. "I want you to live with it," I said simply. "Every day. Every time you see Edward's portrait. Every time someone mentions his name. I want you to remember what you did and know that I know. I want you to understand that your comfort, your reputation, your very life is balanced on my silence. You can't prove anything," she said, but there was no conviction in it. "I don't need to prove it to destroy you," I replied. "I just need to suggest it, to let the whispers start, to have people begin asking questions. Your position in society is built on a foundation of respectability. How long do you think that foundation will hold if I start sharing my suspicions?" "What do you want?" she asked again. "I want you to acknowledge," I said, "that Edward was right to protect me from you. I want you to admit that you never saw me as anything more than an inconvenience to be managed or eliminated. I want you to say it out loud, here, where only I can hear." She was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You were always too clever. Edward should never have married someone who would see through us so clearly." It was the closest she would ever come to confession. "You may remain at Ashford Hall," I said, "but understand that this is my home now, not yours. The East Wing is mine. The income is mine. The power to destroy your reputation is mine. You will treat me with respect, not because you believe I deserve it, but because you are terrified of what I might do if you don't." She stood. At the door, she paused. "He really did love you, didn't he?" "Yes," I said. "And that's what you could never forgive." The years that followed were quiet. Not peaceful. Peace would have required healing that neither of us sought, but quiet. My mother-in-law retreated into the Western Wing and rarely emerged. Marianne moved with her husband to London, where distance made it easier to pretend our family was not fractured beyond repair. I remained at Ashford Hall, but I was not trapped there. I travelled. I attended lectures in London. I became a patron of women's education, using Edward's money to fund scholarships for daughters of governesses and teachers, for girls who had intelligence but not opportunity. I became, in my own modest way, a person of note. Not famous, but respected. People sometimes asked if I would remarry. I smiled and said I was quite content as I was. The truth was that I had learned something precious in those years of solitude and struggle. I did not need another person to give me value. Edward had loved me enough to set me free. That was gift enough to last a lifetime. On the 10th anniversary of his death, I visited his grave alone. It was October, the month when we had married, when the whole world turned gold and crimson, and the air smelled of apples and wood smoke. I brought chrysanthemums, his favourite autumn flower. "I kept your promises," I told the marble stone that bore his name. "I did not forgive them. I did not make myself smaller. I did not let them erase me." The wind moved through the graveyard trees, scattering leaves across the path. "I'm not sure if what I did was revenge or justice," I continued. "Perhaps there's no difference. Perhaps they're the same thing seen from different angles. But I survived. I more than survived. I became someone who could not be dismissed or destroyed. and I did it using the tools you gave me. I sat there for a long time, listening to the sound of autumn dying into winter. When I finally rose to leave, I felt lighter, not because I had forgiven or forgotten, but because I had finished the work Edward had begun. I had reclaimed myself. As I walked back through the gates of Ashford Hall, I looked up at the east wing windows glowing with lamplight. My home, my sanctuary, my proof that love, when it's real, builds fortresses that outlast death. They had laughed at my black dress. They had dismissed my grief as performance, my presence as inconvenience, my very existence as mistake. But Edward had known better. He had known exactly what I was worth and had made sure the world would have to acknowledge it. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all. Not their downfall, but my rise. Not their punishment, but my freedom. Not the destruction of their family, but the indestructible fact of my own dignity, earned and defended, and finally, completely mine.